Marcus Rodriguez pressed his face against the cold glass of the convenience store window, his breath fogging the surface as he peered into the abandoned street beyond. 3 days had passed since the emergency broadcast stopped, since the screaming died down to an eerie silence that now blanketed the once bustling downtown area of Millbrook. The afternoon sun cast long shadows between abandoned cars, their doors left hanging open like broken wings, telling stories of panic and desperate flight that Marcus could only imagine. He'd been working the night shift at Henderson Manufacturing when it all began, and by the time he'd made it home, his neighborhood had already transformed into something from a nightmare. Behind him, Jessica Palmer methodically sorted through the remaining canned goods, her movements precise despite the tremor in her hands that she couldn't quite hide. The former elementary school teacher had found refuge in the store 2 days ago, clutching a blood-stained first aid kit and speaking in whispers about her classroom, about tiny desks overturned and windows shattered. She hadn't elaborated, and Marcus hadn't pressed her for details. Some stories were better left untold, especially when the telling might break what little composure kept them all functioning. "We can't stay here much longer," muttered Derek Thompson from his position behind the counter, where he'd been attempting to get the radio to pick up any signal beyond static and the occasional emergency tone that led nowhere. The former paramedic had arrived at the store with a backpack full of medical supplies and knowledge that had already saved Marcus's life twice, once when he'd nearly walked into a group of those things while scavenging, and again when he'd cut his hand on broken glass and Derek had prevented what could have been a fatal infection. Food's running low, and more importantly, they're getting smarter. The comment sent a chill through the small group that had nothing to do with the October air seeping through the store's damaged ventilation system. In the beginning, the infected had been mindless, stumbling creatures that moved with all the coordination of broken marionettes. They'd shamble toward sound and movement with single-minded determination but little strategy. However, over the past day, Marcus had noticed changes that made his skin crawl. Yesterday, he'd watched 3 of them work together to tip over a dumpster, creating a ramp to reach a fire escape where they'd apparently detected signs of life. This morning, Jessica had spotted one using a rock to break a car window, its movements deliberate and purposeful. "There was a group at the pharmacy yesterday," added Amanda Foster, speaking up from where she sat cross-legged on the floor, carefully cleaning her father's hunting rifle. The 19-year-old college student had been visiting her parents when the outbreak began, and she'd inherited more than just the weapon when her family didn't make it through the first night. Her eyes held a hardness that hadn't been there before, the kind that came from making impossible choices and living with the consequences. 7 of them, moving in formation like soldiers. They weren't just following noise, they were hunting. Marcus turned away from the window, studying the faces of his unlikely companions. None of them had asked to become survivors, to learn that the thin veneer of civilization could be stripped away in mere hours. Derek, with his graying temples and steady hands, had spent his career saving lives in the back of ambulances, never imagining he'd be using those same skills to help people hide from the very patients he once rushed to help. Jessica, who dedicated her life to nurturing young minds, now spent her days figuring out which buildings offered the best defensive positions and escape routes. Amanda, who should have been worrying about midterm exams and weekend parties, instead calculated ammunition supplies and studied the behavioral patterns of creatures that had once been her neighbors. The sound that interrupted his thoughts was subtle, a soft scraping against concrete that might have been overlooked in the old world but now commanded immediate attention. Marcus held up his hand, and the group fell silent, each of them instinctively reaching for their chosen weapons. The scraping continued, rhythmic and deliberate, accompanied by what sounded like whispered communication. Through the window, Marcus could see them emerging from the alley across the street, moving with a coordination that sent ice through his veins. 5 infected individuals moved in a loose formation, their heads turning in synchronized sweeps as they scanned the environment. Their clothes were torn and stained, their skin bearing the telltale gray pallor and dark veins that marked their condition, but their movements were far from the clumsy shambling they'd exhibited just days before. One of them, a tall figure in what had once been a business suit, raised its hand and pointed directly at the convenience store. The others immediately shifted their attention to the building, and Marcus realized with growing horror that they'd been spotted. "They know we're here," he whispered, stepping back from the window as the group across the street began moving toward them with purpose. "Everyone grab your gear. We're leaving now." The infected had learned to hunt in packs, and Marcus understood that their temporary sanctuary had just become a trap. The next 60 seconds unfolded like a carefully choreographed disaster as Derek swept his medical supplies into his backpack while Amanda slung her rifle across her shoulder and grabbed the ammunition box they'd been rationing. Jessica clutched her makeshift weapon, a crowbar she'd found in the store's back room, and moved toward the rear exit with the fluid efficiency of someone who'd rehearsed this moment in her nightmares. Marcus took one final look through the front window and felt his stomach drop as he counted not 5, but 12 infected individuals now converging on their location, emerging from doorways and from behind vehicles as if they'd been lying in wait. The business-suited figure that had spotted them was gesturing to the others, its mouth moving in what appeared to be actual communication, and Marcus realized they weren't dealing with mindless predators anymore, they were facing something that could think, plan, and coordinate attacks. "Back exit, now," Marcus hissed, shouldering his own pack and gripping the tire iron that had become his constant companion. The 4 survivors moved through the store's narrow aisles with practiced silence, stepping over debris and avoiding the squeaky floorboard near the refrigerated section that they'd learned to navigate around during their 3-day stay. Behind them, the front door's glass rattled as something tested its strength, followed by the distinctive sound of multiple sets of hands pressing against the surface. The infected weren't trying to break in yet, they were examining the entrance, studying it the way a team of specialists might assess a building before beginning a demolition project. Derek reached the back door first and slowly turned the handle, wincing as the hinges produced a soft groan that seemed to echo like a gunshot in the tense silence. Beyond the door lay a narrow alley that connected to a maze of service roads and loading docks, an urban landscape that had once buzzed with delivery trucks and worker activity but now stood as empty as a film set after the cameras stopped rolling. The afternoon shadows provided some cover, but Marcus knew that darkness would bring its own dangers. The infected seemed to move more confidently at night, as if the absence of light somehow enhanced their other senses. Jessica slipped through the doorway first, her teacher's instincts for protecting others having evolved into a tactical awareness that impressed Marcus daily. She pressed herself against the brick wall and scanned both directions before signaling the all-clear with a subtle hand gesture they developed during their time together. Amanda followed, her rifle ready but pointed downward to avoid any accidental discharge that might announce their position to every infected creature within a mile radius. Derek emerged next, already reaching into his pack for the small mirror he used to check blind corners, a habit from his paramedic days that had saved them from walking into ambushes twice already. As Marcus prepared to follow his companions into the alley, the sound of splintering wood erupted from the front of the store, followed immediately by the shuffling of multiple footsteps moving through the aisles they'd just vacated. The infected had broken through, and from the way their movements echoed through the building, Marcus could tell they were spreading out to search systematically rather than simply rushing forward in pursuit. These weren't the same creatures that had stumbled blindly through the streets during the first days of the outbreak. These were something new, something evolved, and something infinitely more dangerous. "They're inside," Marcus whispered as he joined the group in the alley, carefully closing the door behind him and hoping the infected wouldn't immediately discover their escape route. The 4 survivors moved away from the building in single file, using Derek's mirror system to check each intersection before proceeding. The urban landscape around them told the story of a civilization that had collapsed with stunning speed, abandoned shopping carts filled with scattered belongings, cars with their engines still running until they'd consumed their final drops of gasoline, and windows broken from the inside as people had fought desperately to escape buildings that had become tombs. Amanda suddenly raised her fist, bringing the group to an immediate halt as she pointed toward a loading dock 50 yards ahead where movement had caught her attention. 2 infected individuals stood motionless beside a delivery truck, their heads tilted at identical angles as if listening for something specific. What chilled Marcus to the bone was their posture. They weren't shambling or swaying like the infected he'd encountered before. They were standing guard, positioned to observe multiple approach routes with the tactical awareness of trained sentries. "They're posted as lookouts," Derek breathed, his voice barely audible as he lowered his mirror and processed what they were observing. This isn't random behavior, they're establishing perimeters and patrol patterns. The implications of Derek's observation settled over the group like a suffocating blanket. If the infected were capable of coordinating defensive positions and establishing surveillance networks, then every assumption they'd made about survival tactics needed to be reconsidered. The rules of engagement had fundamentally changed, transforming their situation from a crisis of endurance into something approaching actual warfare against an enemy that was learning to think strategically. Marcus felt the weight of leadership settling on his shoulders as he realized their small group might be facing not just individual threats, but an organized force that was adapting and evolving with each passing hour, becoming more dangerous as it learned to exploit human weaknesses and predict human behavior. The standoff stretched for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, with Marcus and his companions crouched behind a rusted dumpster while the two infected sentries maintained their positions near the loading dock. The creatures hadn't moved so much as an inch since the survivors had spotted them, standing with an unnatural stillness that spoke to a level of discipline that made Marcus's skin crawl. In the old world, even trained soldiers would shift their weight, adjust their stance, or show some sign of fatigue during extended surveillance duties, but these things possessed an inhuman patience that suggested they could wait indefinitely for their prey to make a mistake. Jessica tapped Marcus's shoulder and pointed toward a fire escape ladder on the building to their right, indicating a potential route that might allow them to bypass the sentries entirely. The ladder was old and showed signs of rust, but it appeared sturdy enough to support their weight, and more importantly, it would give them access to the rooftops where they might be able to move undetected. Marcus studied the approach carefully, noting that they would need to cross approximately 20 feet of open ground to reach the building, during which they would be completely exposed to the infected lookouts if those creatures possessed better peripheral vision than they were assuming. Derek pulled out a small notebook he'd been using to track their observations about infected behavior and quickly sketched a rough map of their current position, marking the locations of the sentries and indicating possible escape routes with arrows and symbols. His medical training had given him a methodical approach to problem-solving that proved invaluable in their current circumstances, treating each tactical decision like a diagnosis that required careful analysis of symptoms and variables. He wrote a quick note and showed it to the others. Pattern suggests 3-hour shifts. Arrival time indicates changeover in 45 minutes. Amanda studied Derek's analysis and nodded slowly, then pointed to her watch and held up 4 fingers, followed by 5 fingers, indicating she'd observed similar patterns over the past 2 days and estimated the guard rotation at approximately 45-minute intervals. Her background as a college student studying behavioral psychology had given her an unexpected advantage in recognizing patterns and predicting responses, skills that had proven crucial to their survival. She'd been the first to notice that the infected seemed to respond more aggressively to certain types of movement and sound, leading to protocols that had kept them alive during several close encounters. Marcus made the decision to wait for the rotation, gambling that new sentries might be less alert during the first few minutes of their watch as they settled into position. The group settled in for a tense wait, each of them fighting against the psychological pressure of remaining motionless while knowing that discovery meant almost certain death. The infected had demonstrated a disturbing trend toward capturing rather than immediately killing their prey, dragging survivors to locations that none of the group wanted to contemplate too deeply based on the screams they'd heard echoing from various buildings during the night hours. The distant sound of footsteps on concrete announced the approach of the relief guard before they came into view, and Marcus felt his blood turn to ice as he counted not 2, but 6 infected individuals moving toward the loading dock in a formation that resembled a military patrol. The original sentries stepped away from their positions with movements that looked almost formal, like soldiers being relieved of duty, while the newcomers took their places with an efficiency that spoke to repeated practice. 2 of the new arrivals positioned themselves exactly where the previous guards had stood, while the other 4 spread out to establish a wider perimeter that included positions they hadn't noticed before. "They're expanding their coverage," Derek whispered, his voice tight with concern as he updated his sketch to reflect the new deployment pattern. The infected weren't just maintaining their surveillance network, they were improving it, learning from experience and adapting their tactics in real time. Marcus realized they were witnessing the birth of something unprecedented, an enemy force that combined the relentlessness of infection with the strategic thinking of military intelligence. Jessica pointed toward a narrow gap between two buildings that had previously been outside the surveillance zone but was now being watched by one of the new sentries. Their planned escape route had been compromised before they'd even attempted to use it, suggesting that the infected weren't just responding to immediate threats but were actively anticipating human behavior and closing off potential escape paths. The implications were staggering. If the infected could predict and counter human tactical thinking, then traditional survival strategies might be not only useless but actively dangerous. Amanda raised her rifle slightly, not aiming but simply checking her sight picture while calculating angles and distances. Marcus caught her eye and shook his head firmly, knowing that any aggressive action would bring the entire network down on them while revealing their position to infected forces they couldn't see yet. The young woman nodded reluctantly but kept her weapon ready, understanding that their situation was deteriorating rapidly and that violence might become unavoidable regardless of their preferences. The sound that changed everything was subtle, a soft whistle that seemed to come from multiple directions simultaneously, followed by an answering call from somewhere behind them. Marcus realized with growing horror that they hadn't just stumbled into a surveillance perimeter, they'd walked into the center of a carefully laid trap, and the infected forces were now closing the circle around them with the methodical precision of experienced hunters who had finally cornered their prey. The whistling sounds formed a communication network that stretched far beyond what Marcus had initially assumed, creating an invisible web of coordination that encompassed several city blocks and suggested an infected population that had organized itself into something resembling a military unit. Derek's notebook fell from his trembling hands as the full scope of their predicament became clear. They weren't facing a handful of evolved creatures, but rather the advanced scouts of what appeared to be a coordinated infected army that had been systematically hunting the remaining human survivors with tactics that would have impressed seasoned combat veterans. The realization hit Marcus like a physical blow as he understood they'd been tracked, herded, and maneuvered into this position over the course of several days by an intelligence that had been studying their patterns and predicting their movements. Jessica's face had gone pale as she pressed herself against the dumpster, her knuckles white as she gripped her crowbar with the desperate intensity of someone who knew the next few minutes would determine whether she lived to see another sunset. Her teaching background had given her experience in managing chaotic situations and thinking quickly under pressure, but nothing in her educational training had prepared her for coordinating an escape from creatures that combined the persistence of predators with the strategic thinking of human generals. She pointed toward a storm drain cover approximately 30 feet away, indicating what might be their only remaining option for escape, though the route would require them to cross open ground while under direct observation from multiple infected sentries. Amanda adjusted her rifle scope and began scanning the surrounding buildings for signs of additional infected forces, her college psychology training having taught her to look for behavioral patterns and environmental clues that might reveal the true extent of the threat they were facing. Through her scope, she could see movement in upper-story windows of buildings that had appeared abandoned, suggesting that the infected had established observation posts throughout the area and were likely monitoring multiple groups of survivors simultaneously. The scope of the operation was staggering. These weren't random encounters with mindless creatures, but calculated military engagements against an enemy force that had somehow retained human intelligence while gaining enhanced physical capabilities. Derek retrieved his notebook and quickly began sketching escape routes while calculating the time they would need to reach various potential exits, his paramedic experience with emergency response having given him the ability to think clearly under extreme pressure while making life-or-death decisions in seconds rather than minutes. His analysis revealed what they all suspected but nobody wanted to acknowledge. Every conventional escape route had been anticipated and was likely being monitored by infected forces that had positioned themselves to intercept fleeing survivors. The storm drain represented their best chance for escape, but reaching it would require a coordinated movement that exposed them to attack from multiple directions while hoping that the infected hadn't already secured the underground access points. Marcus made the decision that would either save their lives or seal their fate, indicating to the others that they would make a coordinated rush toward the storm drain on his signal while Amanda provided covering fire to suppress any infected forces that moved to intercept them. The plan was simple, desperate, and probably suicidal, but remaining in their current position guaranteed capture or death as the infected network continued to tighten around them like a noose. He counted down from 5 using hand signals, watching as his companions prepared themselves for what might be their final moments, each of them understanding that failure meant not just death but something potentially worse based on the screams they'd heard echoing from infected-controlled buildings during previous nights. The dash across open ground felt like running through a nightmare as Marcus led the group toward the storm drain while infected sentries erupted from concealed positions throughout the area, moving with coordinated precision that transformed the rescue attempt into a running battle across an urban battlefield. Amanda's rifle cracked repeatedly as she fired at infected forces attempting to cut off their escape route, her shots carefully placed to wound rather than kill in hopes of creating obstacles that would slow pursuit without requiring the ammunition they couldn't spare for extended firefights. Derek stumbled halfway across the open area but recovered quickly, his medical bag bouncing against his back as he pushed himself beyond his normal physical limits while fighting against the knowledge that falling behind meant abandoning his companions to face an impossible situation. Jessica reached the storm drain first and began working frantically to lift the heavy metal cover while the others formed a defensive perimeter around her position, each of them fighting against infected forces that approached with the tactical coordination of trained soldiers rather than the mindless hunger they'd expected from creatures driven by viral infection. The metal cover was heavier than anticipated and seemed to resist her efforts as if it had been deliberately secured, leading to the terrifying possibility that the infected had already considered this escape route and had taken steps to prevent its use. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew louder as more infected forces converged on their position, their movements coordinated by the whistling communication system that continued to echo throughout the urban landscape like the calls of hunting wolves closing in on wounded prey. Part 5 *. Marcus threw his full weight against the storm drain cover alongside Jessica, their combined effort finally creating enough leverage to shift the metal grate as Amanda's rifle fire echoed off the surrounding buildings and Derek shouted warnings about infected forces approaching from their left flank. The heavy cover scraped against concrete with a grinding sound that seemed to announce their location to every creature within miles, but Marcus knew they were past the point of stealth and into pure survival mode where speed mattered more than silence. As the grate finally swung open, revealing a dark tunnel that dropped into the city's underground infrastructure, the smell of stagnant water and decay wafted up to meet them, carrying with it the promise of escape and the threat of unknown dangers lurking in the darkness below. Amanda fired her last round at an infected figure that had emerged from behind an overturned car barely 20 yards away, watching with grim satisfaction as her shot spun the creature around and sent it stumbling into two others that had been following close behind. Her ammunition was now completely exhausted, leaving the group with only Derek's small pistol and their makeshift weapons to defend against pursuit, but she'd bought them the precious seconds they needed to reach the storm drain entrance. She slung her rifle across her back and dove toward the opening as Marcus waved the others forward, knowing that hesitation now would mean death for all of them as the infected forces continued to converge on their position with military-style coordination. Derek stumbled as he approached the storm drain, his medical bag catching on a piece of debris and nearly sending him sprawling across the pavement as infected voices echoed from multiple directions around them. The sounds they made weren't quite human speech but contained enough structure and variation to suggest complex communication, as if the infection had preserved language centers while enhancing them for tactical coordination. He freed his bag and dove for the opening just as Jessica disappeared into the darkness below, followed by Amanda's splash as she hit the water at the bottom of the tunnel. Marcus provided covering fire with Derek's pistol, though his shots were more intended to discourage pursuit than inflict casualties given their limited ammunition. The drop into the storm drain was deeper than expected, landing Marcus in knee-deep water that moved with a sluggish current toward what he hoped was an exit to the river rather than a dead end in the city's underground maze. The tunnel stretched in both directions beyond the reach of the dim light filtering down from the street opening, creating an environment where their flashlights would be essential but would also announce their position to anything else that might be sharing the underground space. Jessica was already moving downstream, her crowbar ready as she tested each step carefully to avoid holes or obstacles hidden beneath the murky water, while Amanda checked their rear approach with her now empty rifle held like a club. Derek sealed his medical bag as tightly as possible before following the others through the tunnel, knowing that his supplies represented their only hope of treating injuries in an environment where even minor wounds could become fatal infections. The water around his legs was cold and carried debris that bumped against him as he moved, including objects that felt disturbingly organic and made him grateful for the poor visibility that prevented him from identifying what he was walking through. Above them, the sounds of infected forces gathering around the storm drain opening created an ominous backdrop that suggested their pursuers were debating whether to follow them underground or establish a perimeter to wait for their eventual emergence. The tunnel system proved to be more complex than any of them had anticipated, with multiple branches and levels that created opportunities for both escape and entrapment depending on the choices they made in the darkness ahead. Marcus led the group with his flashlight held low to minimize their visibility from a distance while providing enough illumination to avoid the worst obstacles in their path. The current grew stronger as they moved downstream, suggesting they were approaching a main collection point where multiple tunnels converged, which could either provide access to the river system or lead them directly into a trap if the infected had anticipated this escape route. Amanda suddenly grabbed Marcus's shoulder and pointed toward a section of tunnel wall where fresh scratches in the concrete suggested recent passage of clawed hands, the marks too deep and too numerous to have been made by human fingernails but too purposeful to be accidental damage. The discovery confirmed their worst fear. The infected had already explored the underground system and were likely familiar with its layout, meaning the survivors were moving through territory that their enemies knew better than they did. The tactical advantage had shifted once again, transforming their escape route into a potential funnel that could channel them directly into waiting ambushes. The sound that froze them all in place came from ahead rather than behind, a soft splashing that indicated movement in the tunnel system beyond the range of their flashlights, accompanied by the same whistling communication they'd heard on the surface but now distorted by the acoustic properties of the underground environment. Marcus realized with growing dread that they hadn't escaped the infected network but had instead entered a different level of the same coordinated hunting system, one that extended throughout the city's infrastructure and left no territory truly safe for human survivors. The whistle calls were answered from multiple directions, suggesting that infected forces were moving to surround them in the tunnels just as they had done on the surface, turning their underground escape into another carefully orchestrated trap. Part 6 *. Marcus extinguished his flashlight immediately and signaled for the others to do the same, plunging their section of tunnel into a darkness so complete that it felt like being buried alive, while the splashing sounds ahead grew more distinct and purposeful as multiple sets of feet moved through the water with the confident rhythm of creatures that could navigate these tunnels without any light at all. The whistle communications continued to echo through the underground system, creating a three-dimensional network of sound that revealed the true scope of the infected presence beneath the city. They weren't dealing with a few creatures that had wandered into the storm drains, but rather an entire underground population that had claimed the tunnel system as their territory and hunting ground. Jessica pressed herself against the tunnel wall and tried to control her breathing as the reality of their situation became clear. They were trapped between infected forces behind them at the storm drain entrance and additional creatures ahead that seemed to be moving with purpose toward their location. Her years of teaching had given her experience in managing panic and thinking clearly during crisis situations, but the complete darkness combined with the sound of approaching predators created a level of terror that threatened to overwhelm her rational mind. She gripped her crowbar tighter and tried to remember the tunnel layout they'd observed during their brief journey, searching for any detail that might suggest alternative routes or defensive positions. Derek carefully opened his medical bag and retrieved a small chemical light stick, the kind used by emergency responders for situations where conventional lighting might be dangerous or impractical. He hesitated before activating it, knowing that any illumination would reveal their position but also understanding that moving blindly through the tunnel system would likely lead them directly into the waiting infected forces. The soft green glow that emerged when he cracked the stick provided just enough light to reveal their immediate surroundings without creating the bright beacon that a flashlight would produce, showing them a tunnel junction approximately 50 feet ahead where multiple passages converged. Amanda studied the tunnel junction through the dim green light and realized they were approaching what appeared to be a major intersection in the underground system, a location that would naturally serve as a choke point for anyone attempting to control movement through the tunnels. The tactical implications were disturbing. If the infected had established control over key intersections throughout the underground network, they could effectively channel human survivors into predetermined killing zones while maintaining complete knowledge of every possible escape route. Her psychology background helped her recognize the sophisticated level of strategic thinking required for such coordination, suggesting that the infection hadn't just preserved human intelligence but had somehow enhanced it. The splashing sounds from ahead suddenly stopped, replaced by a silence that was somehow more terrifying than the noise of approach had been. Marcus knew from his experience in dangerous situations that predators often went silent just before launching an attack, using the sudden absence of sound to confuse and disorient their prey while positioning themselves for maximum advantage. He motioned for the others to freeze in place while he tried to listen for any clues about the location and number of infected forces that were undoubtedly moving to surround them in the darkness, his every instinct screaming that they were walking into a carefully prepared ambush. Derek's chemical light suddenly revealed movement at the tunnel junction as a figure emerged from one of the side passages, followed by another, then another, until Marcus counted at least 8 infected individuals positioned to block their forward progress. What made the sight particularly disturbing was their formation. They weren't shambling randomly through the tunnels but had established a coordinated defensive line that covered all possible approach routes while leaving themselves multiple fallback positions. The creatures stood motionless in the dim green light, their gray skin and dark veins clearly visible as they waited with the patience of experienced soldiers who knew their prey had nowhere to run. Jessica whispered a prayer under her breath as she realized they were looking at infected individuals who retained enough human memory to use military tactics but combined that knowledge with enhanced physical capabilities and an apparent immunity to fear or fatigue. The figure in the center of the formation appeared to be gesturing to the others with hand signals, coordinating their positions with the silent efficiency of a special operations team preparing for close-quarters combat. The creature's movements were deliberate and calculated, suggesting that not only had the infection preserved tactical knowledge, but it had also maintained the leadership hierarchy necessary for complex operations. Amanda counted the remaining chemical lights in Derek's bag and realized they had perhaps 20 minutes of illumination before being forced to navigate the tunnels in complete darkness against enemies that seemed perfectly adapted to underground combat. The mathematical reality of their situation was stark. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and fighting in an environment where their opponents held every possible advantage. Her rifle was empty, Derek's pistol had limited ammunition, and their improvised weapons would be nearly useless against multiple attackers in the confines of the tunnel system. The infected formation began moving forward with synchronized steps that created a rhythmic splashing sound echoing through the tunnels, advancing at a pace calculated to build psychological pressure while maintaining tactical cohesion. Marcus realized they were witnessing a level of military discipline that suggested the infected weren't just retaining individual human knowledge but were somehow sharing and coordinating that information across their entire population. The implications were staggering. If the infection could preserve and enhance human strategic thinking while adding supernatural coordination capabilities, then traditional survival tactics weren't just inadequate, they were completely obsolete against an enemy that could predict and counter every human response while possessing advantages that no human force could match. Part 7 *. Marcus made a desperate decision that would either save their lives or guarantee their deaths, grabbing Derek's chemical light and hurling it as far as possible down the tunnel beyond the infected formation, watching as the green glow disappeared into the darkness while simultaneously pulling out Derek's pistol and firing 2 shots at the tunnel ceiling above the advancing creatures. The gunshots echoed through the underground system like thunder, while chunks of concrete and debris rained down on the infected formation, but more importantly, the muzzle flashes revealed something that changed everything. A maintenance ladder built into the tunnel wall just 20 feet to their right, leading up to what appeared to be a service access point that might connect to the surface or to other levels of the underground infrastructure. The infected reacted to the gunshots and falling debris with startling speed, but their coordination seemed momentarily disrupted by the unexpected nature of the attack, creating a window of opportunity that Marcus knew would last only seconds before they adapted to the new tactical situation. Jessica saw the ladder at the same moment Marcus did and immediately began moving toward it, her teaching instincts for protecting others driving her to secure the escape route for the group even as infected forces converged on their position from multiple directions. The creature's response to the disruption revealed both a strength and a potential weakness in their coordination. while they could adapt quickly to changing circumstances, the process seemed to require a brief moment of communication and reorganization that created vulnerabilities for opponents who could think and act faster than their coordination protocols could adjust. Derek followed Jessica toward the ladder while stuffing his medical supplies back into his bag, understanding that their survival now depended on speed and vertical mobility rather than careful planning or tactical positioning. Amanda grabbed a chunk of concrete from the debris Marcus had brought down and hurled it at the nearest infected creature, watching with grim satisfaction as the impact disrupted its advance and caused it to stumble into two others behind it. The brief confusion in their formation confirmed what she'd suspected from observing their behavior. The infected relied heavily on maintaining specific positioning and communication patterns, and disrupting those patterns could create temporary advantages for survivors who were willing to take desperate risks. She followed the others toward the ladder while using her empty rifle as a club to ward off any infected that came within reach, buying precious seconds for Jessica and Derek to begin their ascent. Derek reached the ladder first and tested its stability before beginning to climb, his medical bag making the ascent awkward but not impossible as he pulled himself upward toward what he hoped was an exit to safety rather than another dead end in the underground maze. Above him, Jessica climbed with the determined efficiency of someone who understood that failure meant not just her own death but the deaths of everyone depending on her to secure their escape route. The ladder was older than the tunnel system and showed signs of corrosion that made each rung a potential failure point, but it held their weight as they climbed toward a service hatch that appeared to be secured from below. Marcus emptied Derek's pistol at the advancing infected formation, not aiming for specific targets but rather trying to create maximum disruption and confusion while his companions escaped up the ladder. His shot sparked off tunnel walls and splashed into the water, but the muzzle flashes revealed the true horror of their situation. Infected forces were emerging from every tunnel entrance and drainage pipe, creating a converging mass of coordinated predators that filled the intersection like water flowing into a basin. The sheer number of creatures suggested that the underground infected population was far larger than anything they'd imagined, representing not just a local threat but potentially a city-wide network of coordinated hunters. Amanda reached the ladder and began climbing as Marcus grabbed the bottom rung, both of them understanding that the infected would reach their position within seconds and that falling behind meant certain death or capture. Above them, Jessica had reached the service hatch and was working frantically to open what appeared to be a heavy metal door secured by multiple latches and possibly electronic locks that had defaulted to a locked position when the city's power grid failed. Derek joined her efforts while maintaining his position on the ladder, using his medical tools to work on the locking mechanism while fighting against the knowledge that every second of delay brought the infected forces closer to their escape route. The creatures reached the base of the ladder just as Marcus pulled his feet up beyond their reach, but instead of climbing in pursuit, they began organizing themselves into a coordinated siege formation that suggested they understood the tactical situation and were preparing for a sustained assault on the survivors' position. Some of the infected began climbing while others positioned themselves to catch anyone who fell, and still others seemed to be examining the tunnel structure for alternative routes that might allow them to outflank the escaping humans. Their behavior demonstrated a level of strategic thinking that went beyond simple predation, suggesting they were capable of complex problem-solving and long-term planning that made them infinitely more dangerous than traditional survival scenarios had prepared anyone to face. Jessica finally succeeded in opening the service hatch, revealing not an exit to the surface but rather access to another level of the underground infrastructure, a maintenance corridor that appeared to run parallel to the main tunnel system and might provide routes to different sections of the city. The discovery was both encouraging and terrifying, offering new possibilities for escape while confirming that the underground network was far more extensive than they'd realized, potentially creating an environment where infected forces could track and hunt survivors throughout the entire urban area without ever needing to expose themselves to surface observation or conventional military response. Part 8 *. The maintenance corridor stretched beyond their flashlight beams like a concrete artery running through the heart of the city's underground infrastructure, its walls lined with pipes, electrical conduits, and access panels that suggested connections to every major building and system in the downtown area. Marcus pulled the service hatch closed behind them and worked to secure the locking mechanism, buying them precious time while knowing that the infected would eventually find ways to breach any barrier they could construct with their limited resources and tools. The corridor offered multiple branching paths that could lead to freedom or deeper into an underground maze where the infected had established complete territorial control, making every choice a potentially fatal gamble that would determine whether they lived to see daylight again or became the latest casualties in humanity's losing war against an enemy that combined the worst aspects of viral infection with enhanced strategic intelligence. Jessica took point as they moved through the maintenance corridor, her teacher's instincts for navigation and spatial reasoning helping her identify junction markers and directional signs that indicated routes toward the river district and the old industrial areas where abandoned factories might provide defensible positions for survivors willing to make a stand against the infected forces. Her crowbar remained ready as she checked each access point and side passage, knowing that the infected had likely mapped these corridors as thoroughly as they had the main tunnel system and could emerge from any direction without warning. The industrial district represented their best hope for finding other survivors and establishing some kind of organized resistance, but reaching it would require traveling several miles through underground territory that belonged entirely to their enemies. Derek monitored their rear approach while inventorying his medical supplies, calculating doses and treatment protocols for injuries they hadn't sustained yet but probably would before their escape was complete. His paramedic experience had taught him to plan for worst-case scenarios, and their current situation represented a cascade of worst-case scenarios that threatened to overwhelm even the most pessimistic contingency planning. The infected had demonstrated capabilities that redefined the nature of their threat. They weren't just dangerous predators but rather an organized enemy force that could think strategically, communicate effectively, and adapt to changing tactical situations faster than human survivors could develop countermeasures. Amanda discovered that her empty rifle could be partially disassembled to create improvised tools for opening access panels and bypassing security systems, her college engineering courses providing unexpected practical value in their desperate circumstances. The maintenance corridor's infrastructure revealed the scope of the infected's underground network. Scratch marks and organic residue on pipes and walls suggested that the creatures had been using the city's service tunnels as highways for coordinated movement, allowing them to appear anywhere in the urban area without surface observation while maintaining communication networks that spanned the entire metropolitan region. The tactical implications were staggering, suggesting that human survivors anywhere in the city were being hunted by an enemy force that possessed complete knowledge of their environment and could coordinate attacks across multiple locations simultaneously. Marcus studied the junction markers and realized they were approaching a major intersection where the maintenance corridor connected to the city's primary underground infrastructure, including power distribution centers, communication hubs, and emergency command facilities that the infected had likely claimed as strategic assets. The discovery explained how the creatures had managed to coordinate their operations so effectively. They had access to the city's nerve centers and could monitor or disrupt any human attempts to organize resistance or establish communication networks. Fighting an enemy that controlled the infrastructure meant that traditional military responses would be ineffective, requiring survival strategies that no government or military organization had ever needed to develop. The sound that announced their discovery by infected forces came not from behind them in the tunnels they'd escaped, but from ahead in the direction they'd been traveling, a rhythmic tapping on pipes that created a communication network throughout the maintenance system. The infected had anticipated their route and were already positioning forces to intercept them at the major junction, transforming their escape into another carefully orchestrated trap that demonstrated the creature's ability to think several moves ahead while maintaining tactical flexibility. Marcus realized they were facing an enemy that combined the strategic thinking of human generals with coordination capabilities that no human force could match. Jessica spotted an emergency exit ladder that led to a surface access point in what appeared to be an abandoned parking garage, offering their first opportunity to reach daylight in what felt like hours but was probably only minutes of underground travel. The ladder was newer than the others they'd encountered and showed signs of recent maintenance, suggesting that city workers or possibly other survivors had used this route recently. Derek checked his watch and realized they'd been underground for less than 30 minutes, though the psychological stress of constant pursuit had made it feel like hours of desperate flight through hostile territory. Amanda climbed first, testing each rung while listening for sounds from the parking garage above that might indicate infected presence or human survivors who could provide assistance or additional threats. The surface access opened into a world transformed by the infection spread, overturned vehicles, broken glass, and the unmistakable signs of desperate battles fought and lost by people who had tried to make their final stands in locations they'd hoped would provide safety. But more importantly, in the distance beyond the parking garage, smoke rose from several buildings in patterns that suggested controlled fires rather than random destruction, indicating that somewhere in the city, human survivors were still fighting back against the infected forces with enough organization and resources to maintain defensive positions. Marcus followed his companions toward the surface, knowing they'd survived their first major encounter with the evolved infected but understanding that the real war for humanity's survival was just beginning, and the enemy they faced was far more dangerous than anyone had imagined possible.